It was a warm afternoon in late October 2007 when Eliza Monroe left Riverside High School, backpack slung over one shoulder, her usual chatter with friends fading as she walked down the quiet streets toward home. Her mother, Karen Monroe, assumed she would be back soon. Eliza had told her she was just taking the long way to visit a friend. But hours passed, and she never returned. When Karen called and got no answer, a knot of unease began to form in her chest. By evening, that unease had grown into fear, and she made the call every parent dreads, the Riverside Police Department. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from right now. Officers arrived quickly, taking statements, filling out the initial reports, documenting Eliza's last known movements. She had left school on time, carried her small purse, and nothing seemed out of place. Witnesses claimed to have seen her walk toward the bus stop, and then she vanished into the neighborhood surrounding Lincoln Avenue. The officers worked the streets, checked nearby parks and vacant lots, spoke to neighbors and canvassed local shops, but there was nothing. No sign of a struggle, no unusual activity, nothing to suggest she hadn't simply run away. The first assumption, and a common one in cases like these, was that she was a runaway. But Karen Monroe knew her daughter. Eliza wasn't the type to run off. She was quiet, attentive, and careful, a teenager with dreams and routines. Karen pleaded with the police to keep an open mind, to dig deeper, but resources were limited. Riverside, though a growing city, didn't have the technology or interagency connections that larger urban centers enjoyed. There was no national missing person database with cross-state alerts, no instant DNA checks, no CCTV to trace her movements. Officers relied on flyers, local media, and tips from the public, and in those first frantic days there were few leads. A neighbor remembered seeing a young man in his 20s moving through the area, friendly, polite, waving to kids in the neighborhood. He didn't stand out, and yet something about his presence lingered in the back of their minds. That man would not appear in the official reports, but years later, his subtle presence would become a chilling detail. Days turned into weeks. Karen and her husband, Michael, organized searches with friends, community volunteers, and local youth groups. They walked streets, checked abandoned lots, and put up flyers with Eliza's smiling face. Candlelight vigils were held at the school, in parks, in front of City Hall. The local media covered the story, broadcasting Eliza's disappearance across Riverside, hoping someone would come forward. Parents warned their teens, urging caution, creating a wave of fear that spread through the community. Despite the efforts, the case stalled. Minor tips came in, calls about a girl seen at a bus station, someone claiming to have glimpsed her in a neighboring city, but none led anywhere. Police maintained the runaway theory, classifying the case as a missing minor with limited evidence of foul play. The lack of a body, no forced entry, and no witnesses made it difficult to pursue a stronger lead. Karen sat in her living room each night, staring at the empty space where Eliza's room once was, imagining the possibilities. She forced herself to hope, while a gnawing dread began to grow, a fear that she was being asked to hope against reason. Nearly 2 years later, in April of 2009, another Riverside teen vanished under eerily similar circumstances. Sophie Delgado, 15, disappeared after school, reportedly walking home along the same streets Eliza had taken years before. Her parents reported her missing, and once again, the police sprang into action. The similarities were immediately noted in internal memos. Same area, similar ages, no witnesses, and both cases involving young girls living in otherwise normal households. Yet publicly, there was no connection drawn. Investigators cautioned against speculation, insisting that coincidence didn't necessarily mean a pattern. Still, for those who had followed Eliza's disappearance, the coincidence was alarming. Sophie's family endured the same nightmare. Calls unanswered, days stretching into weeks, tips that fizzled. Friends remembered Sophie mentioning feeling uncomfortable at home, but details were scarce, incomplete, and often brushed off as adolescent mood swings. Teachers, neighbors, and friends noted the changes, the quiet retreats, the withdrawn smiles, the way she seemed to pull back from casual conversation. Looking back, these were the subtle signs, whispers of distress that went unheard, ignored, or misunderstood. Meanwhile, there was Ethan Caldwell, a neighbor who had been a friendly presence in the community for years. He worked odd jobs, security, maintenance, landscaping, roles that allowed him to blend in without drawing attention. He attended school functions, helped neighbors with errands, and presented himself as harmless, approachable, and dependable. To the casual observer, he was exactly the type of man you would want in the neighborhood. Polite, helpful, almost invisible in his conformity. Off the record, some parents noted odd behaviors, a tendency to linger near young girls, too casual in conversation, but these comments were rarely taken seriously. In 2007 and 2009, he left no official trace in the investigation files. He was a phantom on the periphery, a shadow shaping the unseen, and yet completely unnoticed by authorities and families alike. Detective Lisa Harmon, a Riverside officer who had reviewed both disappearances repeatedly, found herself returning to the cases more than once a month. She knew that missing children didn't always stay missing, that sometimes a break could come years later. Her notes were meticulous. Witness statements, timelines, neighborhood maps, subtle anomalies, each cross-referenced with others. In private, she scribbled hypotheses, patterns she noticed but couldn't yet prove. One detail gnawed at her. Both girls had been last seen walking home along quiet streets. Both disappeared without struggle, both from stable homes. And there were minor reports of a man seen interacting with neighborhood children who was never formally questioned. Harmon's instincts screamed that there was more beneath the surface, but she had nothing concrete to work with. No bodies, no evidence, no definitive suspect. Back in the Monroe and Delgado households, life became a tense cycle of fear, hope, and despair. Karen Monroe visited schools, spoke to teachers, and joined online forums for missing children. She connected with other parents, attended vigils, posted updates, and chased down any tip no matter how unlikely. The Delgado family did the same, driven by desperation and disbelief that Sophie could vanish without a trace. Both families lived under a cloud, every ringing phone or stranger's knock sending pulses of anxiety through their homes. Sleep became fractured, days elongated by unanswered questions, nights haunted by imagined scenarios. Media coverage amplified the tension. Local news outlets ran repeated segments on Eliza and Sophie, broadcasting their photographs and pleas for information. Flyers adorned bus stops, store windows, and school hallways. Community meetings discussed safety protocols, neighborhood watch programs intensified, and parents debated curfews, safe routes, and emergency contacts. Children were warned, parents were hypervigilant, and Riverside found itself grappling with the unsettling reality that 2 young girls had vanished within a 2-year span. Meanwhile, in private spaces away from the families and media, Ethan Caldwell's presence went unnoticed, but was never far from the investigators' subconscious. His interactions, his casual demeanor, the way he existed in plain sight, would later be understood as part of a calculated pattern. For now, he was simply a neighbor, blending in, going about his life, shaping opportunities no one recognized. Detective Harmon, alongside her team, attempted to push beyond the conventional missing child procedures. They reviewed school attendance records, tracked the girls' known acquaintances, and explored potential routes they might have taken. They collaborated informally with detectives in nearby counties, exchanging notes, sharing leads. But this was before the widespread use of integrated DNA databases, and interstate communication was slow, cumbersome, and inconsistent. The systems that would later revolutionize cold case investigations were not yet in place. Investigators could only rely on paper records, witness statements, and community tips. Every lead was examined, every tip logged, but the trail remained frustratingly cold. As weeks became months, a subtle pattern emerged in Harmon's mind, though it remained speculative. Both girls had disappeared along quiet, residential streets. Both were last seen at or near times they would have been traveling alone, away from crowds or cameras. Both belonged to stable families with no history of delinquency or conflict that could explain a voluntary disappearance. And in the shadows there was a man whose routine presence in the neighborhood could have allowed him to observe, to wait, and to act without drawing suspicion. Harmon made mental notes, sometimes writing Caldwell's name in margins with a question mark, wondering if he should have been questioned more thoroughly. Meanwhile, Karen Monroe and the Delgado family felt the weight of helplessness. Community vigils offered some support, but the ache of not knowing was constant. Every day brought a fresh sense of frustration, a painful reminder of the limits of human control. Parents became detectives in their own homes, retracing steps, cross-referencing memories, and trying to piece together a puzzle that offered no answers. Friends and neighbors provided temporary comfort, but ultimately could not fill the gap left by two young girls who had simply disappeared. In the background, subtle shifts in the neighborhood occurred. Parents walked their children to school, teens hesitated to go out alone, and community awareness campaigns were launched. The fear was tangible, yet the invisible predator continued his careful routine, undetected, patient, and calculating. For those who knew him casually, he was unremarkable. For those who would later study the pattern, he was the common thread that had gone unnoticed for far too long. By the end of 2009, the cases of Eliza Monroe and Sophie Delgado remained unsolved. Flyers, news segments, and police bulletins continued to circulate, but the trail had gone cold. Detectives filed notes, families waited, and the neighborhood carried the lingering fear of what had been lost. And in private, Detective Harmon and a handful of colleagues began to sense a pattern, a chilling possibility that the disappearances were not random, that a predator might be hiding in plain sight. Yet, without evidence, they could do nothing but document, speculate, and hope that one day, something, anything, would provide the breakthrough they needed. Before we move forward, take a moment to imagine this from Karen Monroe's perspective. A mother who spent years wondering if her child was alive, and a predator walking freely in her community. Imagine the fear, the sleepless nights, the unanswered calls. If we ignore these stories, if we don't amplify them, we let these victims fade into anonymity. Don't let Eliza, Sophie, or the thousands of other missing teens be forgotten. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell. Watch every story, share them with your friends and family. Because remembering them is the only way we can ensure justice, awareness, and change. And every day you wait to act, the world is a little less safe for the children we care about most. We continue, we document, we remember, we watch, we learn, and we keep the flame of awareness burning for those who cannot speak for themselves. Because in cases like these, the smallest action can eventually make the biggest difference, and it's up to us to make sure no child is ever lost to silence again. 12 marked another shift in the pattern that had begun years earlier in Riverside, California. Maya Patel, a 17-year-old with a quiet demeanor and a love for painting, had spent the afternoon at her friend's house, sketching the trees along the Grand River. It was spring in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the kind of day that felt deceptively calm, soft sunlight streaming across the city streets. By evening, she never returned home. Her mother, Priya Patel, initially thought Maya might have stayed late at a friend's or lost track of time. But as the hours stretched into the night, worry replaced patience. Calls to friends yielded no answers, and by midnight, panic set in. The next morning, Priya filed a missing person report, and for the first time, Grand Rapids law enforcement faced a teen disappearance that eerily mirrored cases from California years prior. Detectives on Maya's case noticed subtle similarities: the victim's age, the timing, the fact that Maya had never been involved in anything that would warrant her sudden disappearance. It was unusual for teens in stable families to vanish without warning. Notes from early interviews mentioned a neighbor who had been unusually attentive to Maya, someone always available to help with errands, casual invitations to spend time with him in his garage, a place where he stored his tools and memorabilia. It was small, almost forgettable, but as investigators sifted through the mundane details, patterns began to emerge. Ethan Caldwell, or at least a man who would later be identified as the orchestrator of these disappearances, was rarely directly implicated, but left subtle traces of presence: a polite hello in the street, a seemingly helpful hand with small favors, a neighbor whose friendliness now seemed calculated in retrospect. By 2015, Portland, Oregon became the stage for the next set of disappearances. 14-year-old Claire Jensen had just finished 8th grade. Her mother, Denise, recalled the nervous tension in Claire's voice the morning she left for school. Something about her gait, the way she glanced over her shoulder as she stepped out, was slightly off. But Denise dismissed it as typical teenage hesitation. Later that day, Denise would receive a call from the school. Claire hadn't been seen leaving campus, and none of her friends had heard from her. Panic flared immediately. Portland police were notified, but initial inquiries yielded nothing. Then, just a year later, Isabella Ramos, a 16-year-old foster child, disappeared from her neighborhood. Her adoptive mother, Margaret, recalled the oddness of the day before Isabella went missing. A friendly stranger had visited the block, asking casual questions about local community events, and Isabella had mentioned feeling uneasy but hadn't elaborated. By now, cold case investigators were beginning to notice what had previously seemed coincidental. Maya's disappearance in Michigan, combined with Claire and Isabella in Oregon, suggested a pattern that spanned states, ages, and circumstances, particularly girls in adoptive or foster care situations. Analysts began cross-referencing old cases, comparing the ages, the geographical movements, and small behavioral patterns noticed in early witness statements. The pieces were starting to form a chilling picture. Hannah Nguyen vanished in Baltimore, Maryland in 2017. 15 years old, quiet, academically gifted, and often lost in her own books, she disappeared after attending a study session. Neighbors recalled a man who had been seen asking directions and offering assistance to local teens on more than one occasion. At the time, it seemed innocent, a stranger being friendly. Investigators now wondered if it was anything but. While the authorities initially treated each disappearance independently, analysts began connecting threads across hundreds of miles. The method was subtle, meticulous. Caldwell, or the man moving like him, was careful to avoid suspicion while inserting himself into the girls' lives in seemingly benign ways. He didn't need to be obvious. His patience and strategic approach allowed him to operate undetected for years. Cold case units began piecing together similarities. All victims were teenage girls, all from adoptive or foster situations, all were last seen within blocks of their schools or homes, and all involved neighbors or friendly adults who had somehow facilitated, directly or indirectly, their removal from their familiar environments. By now, the technological landscape was slowly evolving. Case files were being digitized, DNA tracking systems were being implemented, and interstate communications among law enforcement improved. Detectives started to reach across state lines, comparing notes and reviewing similarities that had gone unnoticed in previous decades. Maya Patel's parents struggled with grief, worry, and the sense that the system might fail them. Priya recalled sitting in the police station while detectives explained that they were starting to see a pattern, a connection that had only recently become visible thanks to more sophisticated databases. They promised to explore interstate connections, but even with new technology, there were gaps. Records missing, tips unlogged, older cases poorly documented. Priya felt a gnawing frustration, the feeling of being caught between hope and helplessness. She wondered if someone in the community knew more than they were willing to say, if small details brushed off by witnesses could have prevented the tragedy. In Portland, Denise Jensen and Margaret Ramos faced similar experiences. Denise had started a local awareness campaign, distributing posters, visiting schools, speaking with other parents. Margaret, whose foster daughter Isabella's disappearance left a permanent void, became an advocate for better background checks for adults interacting with foster children. The family's struggles highlighted both the emotional toll and the systemic gaps in child safety measures. Meanwhile, detectives in Michigan, Oregon, and Maryland were beginning to exchange information, sometimes cautiously, wary of jurisdictional barriers. They noticed minor behavioral clues in the reports: strange phone calls, unaccounted for neighbors, individuals offering transportation without clear reason. It wasn't enough to charge anyone yet, but it suggested someone was moving freely across communities, possibly interstate, using a veneer of normalcy to hide malicious intent. Caldwell's methodology, once examined retrospectively, was remarkably consistent. In Riverside, he'd been friendly to neighbors, available for casual interactions. In Grand Rapids, he offered small favors that built trust. In Portland, he lingered near schools, introduced himself casually to parents, always polite, low profile. In Baltimore, he repeated the same approach, embedding himself quietly into community life. No one saw the full picture because he moved slowly, deliberately, and masked his predatory behavior with a facade of normality. Detectives noted small red flags in all the cases: a history of adoptive or foster placements, teens who mentioned feeling uneasy about certain adults, reports of minor disappearances or odd encounters with neighbors that hadn't been properly documented. Each case file contained subtle hints: a diary entry mentioning someone watching, a friend recalling a man asking about a teen's schedule, a teacher noting strange interactions that didn't seem alarming at the time. Combined, they formed a mosaic that would later reveal Caldwell's reach and his carefully calculated methodology. Public awareness campaigns in Portland and Grand Rapids began to take hold. Posters, online alerts, school announcements, though limited in scope, reminded families that something more serious might be at work. Social media allowed parents to share information rapidly, creating local networks of vigilance. Parents warned children, told them to be cautious of strangers, even the seemingly friendly ones. These warnings, however, could not fully capture the subtle manipulations Caldwell used. He thrived in the gray areas, where friendliness appeared innocent, where small gestures of helpfulness obscured predatory intent. Cold case detectives reviewing these files noted that each disappearance initially seemed isolated. Standard protocols assumed local motivations: teens running away, minor misunderstandings, or impulsive decisions. Investigators now recognized that systemic limitations had inadvertently allowed a predator to exploit trust. Paper records, isolated databases, and the absence of interstate collaboration created a blind spot that Caldwell navigated easily. At the same time, families lived in a constant state of uncertainty. Maya Patel's parents faced sleepless nights, not knowing whether their daughter was safe or lost to some unseen danger. Denise Jensen oscillated between hope and despair, her fear compounded by the lack of leads. Margaret Ramos feared for other foster children in the area, worried that a similar tragedy could strike again. Their experiences underscored the emotional landscape of these crimes, the long-term psychological toll on those left behind, and the persistent fear that the system may not provide answers. By 2017, the evidence of a growing interstate pattern could no longer be ignored. Cold case units in Michigan, Oregon, and Maryland began holding joint briefings, comparing files, timelines, and suspect profiles. They noticed that in each disappearance, the perpetrator had maintained a presence without drawing suspicion, had known when and how to appear helpful, and had targeted specific vulnerabilities: children in foster or adoptive situations who may not have had a strong immediate support system. The similarities became undeniable, and Caldwell, still an unknown figure to most, emerged as the connecting thread. Investigators began to analyze mobility patterns, travel records, and social interactions. They noted that the perpetrators seemed to select victims within particular geographic clusters, always within reach of communities where he could blend in, maintain a low profile, and escape scrutiny. Behavioral analysts began to create a psychological profile: methodical, patient, manipulative, narcissistic, and highly skilled at concealing his true intentions. This profile, once combined with digital and physical evidence, would later be instrumental in identifying him as the common factor across these disappearances. Communities, meanwhile, responded in a mix of fear and vigilance. Neighborhood watches were reinvigorated. School meetings emphasized awareness of strangers and seemingly helpful adults, and the local media ran human interest stories highlighting each missing teen. Despite these efforts, parents and teens alike felt an underlying tension. The idea that someone could be operating quietly, unnoticed, yet close to home, was terrifying. The threat was invisible, and the uncertainty intensified every ordinary moment. A man offering a ride, a neighbor showing unusual interest, or an adult lingering near a playground. By 2017, the emerging pattern raised difficult questions for law enforcement and the public alike. How many other cases had gone unnoticed? How many predatory behaviors had been dismissed as benign or inconsequential? Cold case investigators acknowledged that these patterns, once invisible, were only now being brought to light thanks to improved record-keeping, interstate collaboration, and advances in forensic science. They were beginning to connect dots that had existed for years but were invisible under the old systems, and so the story paused on a knife's edge. Families waited, investigators pushed, and Caldwell moved quietly, leaving traces but never enough to draw attention. The pattern was clear, but the breakthrough, the one that would eventually expose him, had not yet arrived. The tension was real, a creeping dread that spread through communities and law enforcement alike. Questions remained. Was Caldwell truly the link between all these disappearances? Could the pattern be confirmed before another child went missing? Would authorities act fast enough to prevent further tragedy? Here's where we want to hear from you. Looking at the patterns in these cases, the similarities across states, and the subtle behavioral signs of the perpetrator, what do you think investigators should have focused on first? How could communities have recognized the warning signs sooner? Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your insights could shine a light on gaps that even seasoned investigators may overlook. The summer of 2018 in Dayton, Ohio, was warm but tense for the Thompson family. 16-year-old Layla Thompson had been planning a summer trip with her friends, her backpack packed with notebooks, clothes, and a camera she loved carrying everywhere. But that summer, her plans changed in an instant. She didn't come home after school one Friday afternoon. The streets were busy, the sun low on the horizon, and no one noticed the man who had been observing her, someone who had spent years watching patterns, learning routines, calculating opportunities. By the time her absence was reported, precious hours had already passed. The police launched an immediate investigation. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, spoke to friends and teachers, and checked the bus schedules and local hangouts. Witnesses mentioned seeing her speaking briefly to a friendly man who offered assistance when she seemed lost near the shopping plaza. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but detectives filed it carefully. At first, many believed she had run away. Teenagers were known for testing boundaries, for pushing against parental rules. But Layla's mother, Caroline Thompson, knew better. Her daughter had never skipped school or disappeared without a call. Her gut screamed that something far darker had happened. Meanwhile, investigators in Grand Rapids were noticing subtle patterns in their cold case files. Maya Patel had disappeared 6 years earlier under eerily similar circumstances. A teenage girl, alone after school, gone without a trace, leaving a family desperate for answers. At first, the two cases seemed unrelated, separated by state lines and years, but the digital age had begun allowing investigators to cross-reference tips, descriptions, and even handwriting in old reports. Suddenly, the similarities could not be ignored. The weight of the missing girls was growing too heavy to dismiss as coincidence. By the time 2019 arrived, the focus had widened. In Chicago, 17-year-old Naomi Brooks vanished while visiting her grandmother in the city. Naomi's disappearance mirrored the earlier cases. She was under the care of relatives, had been planning her day, and yet she never made it back home. Parents were growing anxious. Teenagers were being warned repeatedly to stay close to safe spaces, and local news outlets were running repeated features on missing teens. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags, with community groups formed to track sightings and tips. People wanted answers, but the trail remained frustratingly cold. By the time the task force began consolidating files in late 2019, the Portland cases were no longer treated as isolated tragedies. Detectives weren't rereading witness statements for emotional context anymore. They were stripping the cases down to data. Dates, distances, living arrangements, points of access. Looking back at the disappearances of Claire Jensen and Isabella Ramos, investigators now realized the same structural vulnerabilities were present that appeared again and again in later cases. Unstable guardianship histories, limited digital footprints, and environments where trust was extended quickly and oversight was thin. What had once seemed like coincidence now sat squarely within a repeating framework. Portland wasn't the beginning, and it wasn't the end, but it was a critical midpoint, a moment where the pattern briefly surfaced before slipping away again. By 2020, the national scope of the disappearances was undeniable. Hannah Nguyen vanished from Baltimore, Maryland, while walking home from a part-time job at a local cafe. Detectives noticed similarities. Young girls, often in foster or adoptive care, familiar with their environment but taken while moving between trusted spaces, all within a decade-long window. Cold case units across Riverside, Grand Rapids, Portland, Chicago, Dayton, and Baltimore began quietly sharing information. Case files, once locked in cabinets, were digitized. Analysts cross-referenced addresses, job histories, and even minor legal infractions of neighbors. One name began surfacing more often than the others: Ethan Caldwell. A man who had lived quietly in Riverside years earlier, known to offer help in the community, with a clean criminal record that masked years of manipulation and abuse. Caldwell's methods were becoming clearer to investigators, though at the time no one could connect him definitively to all the cases. He was methodical, he observed routines, exploited gaps in supervision, and carefully created opportunities to isolate victims. He moved from city to city, adopting low-profile jobs that allowed him access to homes and neighborhoods where he could blend seamlessly. Families often described him as polite, helpful, even charming. A man who seemed trustworthy and concerned for their children's well-being. That trust, painstakingly earned, allowed him to operate undetected for years. Cold case detectives pored over old witness statements, noting subtle inconsistencies. In Portland, neighbors had mentioned a man who lingered at bus stops near schools and parks. In Grand Rapids, someone had noted a car parked outside Maya Patel's home hours before she disappeared. Investigators began mapping his movements, overlaying missing persons reports with employment records, public assistance logs, and anecdotal neighborhood accounts. Slowly, the outline of a predator emerged, one who targeted vulnerable teens, often connected to foster or adoptive systems, traveling across states, leaving behind fear and grief in multiple communities. Families were exhausted, their emotional reserves tested to the limit. Margaret Ramos, Isabella's adoptive mother, recounted sleepless nights pacing her kitchen, imagining the worst, questioning whether she had failed her daughter. Denise Jensen would spend hours in front of her laptop, checking social media groups for tips, tracking sightings, and sometimes crying in frustration when nothing materialized. Community vigils became regular occurrences, small groups of parents, friends, and local law enforcement coming together, candles flickering in the cold Portland evenings. Each flame a silent plea for return and safety. In Dayton, Caroline Thompson found herself replaying the last moments she had seen Layla, analyzing every interaction, every conversation. The mundane suddenly felt sinister. Was it a glance from a passerby, a neighbor's comment, the note Layla left behind? All of it took on new significance in hindsight, colored by fear and the unrelenting need for answers. The community began to notice an increasing number of missing teen reports in the media. Parents posted warnings on local Facebook pages, school newsletters reminded students to be vigilant, and local journalists started asking uncomfortable questions about systemic failures in foster care, adoption oversight, and missing child investigations. Meanwhile, investigators used the emerging tools of data analytics to track patterns that were once invisible. Financial transactions, public employment history, and even minor criminal records were digitized and cross-referenced. When Naomi Brooks disappeared, analysts noted a route similar to Caldwell's previous known locations and employment patterns. They began to construct a suspect profile. White male, mid-40s to 50s, itinerant within certain regional corridors, able to establish trust easily and adept at evading scrutiny. Every case added a piece to the puzzle, creating a chilling mosaic of predation and careful planning. Caldwell's manipulations extended beyond physical proximity. He was skilled at psychological tactics, exploiting teenagers' vulnerabilities and their desires for attention, independence, or guidance. He ingratiated himself with families, often volunteering, helping with chores, or offering rides. He paid attention to daily routines, noting when supervision was minimal. Detectives reviewing old case files began to realize that he wasn't just opportunistic, he was calculating, patient, and frighteningly disciplined. By the time authorities fully realized the pattern, he had already moved multiple states away from Riverside, leaving fragmented trails and heartbroken families behind. Across the country, the impact on families was compounded by the lack of immediate leads. Some communities felt anger at law enforcement, frustrated by the slow pace and perceived inaction. Others internalized guilt, wondering if they could have prevented their child's disappearance. In Chicago, Naomi Brooks' mother described evenings filled with dread, checking every text, every social media update, every missed call, praying that her daughter was safe, hoping against hope. Detectives began coordinating through informal networks and emerging federal databases. They exchanged tips, discussed timelines, and started to see how these isolated disappearances were threads in a much larger web. By 2021, it became impossible to ignore the similarities: the ages of the victims, the foster and adoptive connections, the geographic patterns, and the psychological manipulations. Each disappearance wasn't a standalone tragedy. It was part of an evolving pattern pointing toward one man, one predator who had eluded justice for far too long. Families, while desperate for answers, remained cautiously hopeful. Media outlets covered the interstate pattern extensively, highlighting the dangers of exploitation, the vulnerabilities in foster and adoptive systems, and the need for vigilance in communities. Support groups and advocacy organizations sprang into action, offering counseling and platforms for parents to share information. Social media amplified the reach of these warnings, and for the first time, investigators felt the momentum shift. The public was paying attention, awareness was growing, and Caldwell's shadow could no longer remain hidden. Subtle but significant clues began to emerge from old case files. Surveillance footage, once thought irrelevant, now offered context when matched with later patterns. Phone records, social media interactions, and employment logs were scrutinized. Investigators began noting that Caldwell's low-profile jobs often put him in proximity to multiple families over time. He was always polite, helpful, seemingly harmless, but the pattern was unmistakable. A methodical, calculated predator had been operating across the country for over a decade, and the evidence was finally coalescing. It was a painstaking process. Every missing girl, every small tip, every neighborhood observation was revisited. Investigators held joint conferences, linking timelines across Riverside, Grand Rapids, Portland, Chicago, Dayton, and Baltimore. Analysts flagged Caldwell as a person of interest, combining historical interactions, geographic mobility, and behavioral patterns. For the first time, a credible profile emerged, offering a clear path toward apprehension. The emotional toll on families was immense. The realization that a single individual might have been responsible for the interstate series of disappearances was both terrifying and validating. Terrifying because of the scale of the predator's manipulation, validating because it confirmed parents' worst fears had always been grounded in reality. As the task forces consolidated evidence and narrowed their suspect list, the public watched with anxious attention. News stories emphasized the emerging pattern, cautioning parents, students, and community members. Social media amplified awareness campaigns, with parents sharing resources, safety tips, and updates on investigative progress. Families clung to the hope that this profile might finally bring resolution, while simultaneously grappling with the horror of understanding the extent of Caldwell's calculated crimes. By late 2021, investigators had enough corroborating evidence to focus on Caldwell. His financial records, employment history, and prior minor law enforcement interactions painted a picture of a man capable of sustained manipulation and interstate predation. Each victim's story was interlinked through subtle behavioral signatures, travel patterns, and repeated opportunities exploited within foster and adoptive systems. Forensic specialists and criminal profilers worked in tandem to ensure that every piece of the puzzle fit, building a compelling profile that bridged the past decade of disappearances. The stage was set. Caldwell had been operating under the radar for years, carefully avoiding suspicion. But with the convergence of advanced technology, collaborative task forces, and relentless detective work, the net was closing. Families, detectives, and communities across the country were on edge, holding their collective breath. The final pieces of evidence would determine whether Caldwell's spree could finally be stopped before any further harm was done. Before we move forward, take a moment to imagine being one of these parents. The fear, the sleepless nights, the uncertainty, and the gnawing feeling that someone dangerous is in your community. Now, consider the broader implications. There are thousands of missing teens whose stories never make headlines, whose disappearances might go unnoticed. What would you do if it was your child? Would you act differently, notice the signs sooner, ask the right questions? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share your feelings, your insights, your outrage. These voices matter because raising awareness is the first step in keeping our children safe, and your engagement could make the difference in someone else's story. The year was 2023, and after years of painstaking work, cold case investigators across multiple states had finally begun to see the faint threads connecting a string of disappearances that had haunted families and communities for over a decade. What had once been isolated reports, Eliza Monroe vanishing from Riverside in 2007, Sophie Delgado 2 years later, Maya Patel in Grand Rapids, Claire Jensen and Isabella Ramos in Portland, Hannah Nguyen in Baltimore, and finally the trio of Layla Thompson, Naomi Brooks, and Gabrielle Ortiz were starting to form a chilling pattern. Each case shared similarities. Teenage girls, some in foster or adoptive care, all last seen in moments of vulnerability. Each disappearance had initially been treated in isolation, and for years the families had been left without answers, clinging to hope, praying that their daughters had somehow run away or found refuge elsewhere. But by 2023, technology, persistence, and interagency collaboration had converged, offering the first real hope that the pattern could be broken, that the truth could finally emerge, and that a predator who had long hidden in plain sight might be unmasked. Detectives meticulously cross-referenced decades-old reports, digitized every scrap of evidence, and entered minor tips and witness statements into advanced data analysis software. The new systems could detect subtle correlations that humans might have missed, overlapping travel patterns, similarities in victim profiles, small geographic consistencies. Analysts pored over every address the suspect had held, employment records, utility bills, social media footprints, and vehicle registrations. And while the suspect, Ethan Caldwell, had kept a low profile, shifting between odd jobs and modest apartments, the accumulation of years of digital and forensic footprints began to paint a disturbing picture of a man whose mobility, manipulation, and meticulous planning had allowed him to evade justice. By early 2024, the investigators had enough evidence to begin physical surveillance. Caldwell, now in his late 50s, was residing quietly in a suburban neighborhood of Virginia Beach. To the casual observer, he appeared unremarkable. Friendly with neighbors, courteous at the local grocery store, a man who blended seamlessly into his surroundings. But investigators knew better. They knew the meticulous, patient predator that lurked beneath the veneer of normalcy. Surveillance teams documented his comings and goings, noting patterns, occasional visits to storage units, and interactions that would, in hindsight, signal his involvement in the disappearances. Each day the team watched, the weight of responsibility pressed heavier upon them. They were not only hunting a man, they were chasing the ghosts of every girl who had vanished under eerily similar circumstances. Finally, in late 2025, all the preparations culminated. Caldwell was arrested at his Virginia Beach apartment. Officers in plain clothes approached him early in the morning. His expression, a mix of mild surprise and practiced composure, betrayed nothing at first glance. He was calm, cooperative enough to comply with the arrest, but silent when asked to comment. Immediately, he requested an attorney, a predictable move that investigators had anticipated. Caldwell had always been cautious, calculating, understanding that even a small misstep could undo his carefully constructed life. But the authorities were equally prepared. They had documentation, evidence chains, and interstate cooperation protocols firmly in place. As Caldwell was transported to the Virginia Beach Detention Center, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on the families who had spent years in limbo. Karen Monroe, mother of Eliza, had been awake since dawn, holding on to hope but also bracing herself for disappointment. Denise Jensen, Claire's mother, sat silently, staring at her phone, waiting for any confirmation. Margaret Ramos, Isabella's adoptive mother, had tears streaming down her face, a mix of fear, disbelief, and anticipation. In homes across Michigan, Oregon, Ohio, Illinois, and Maryland, families waited, bracing for news that might shatter or finally bring relief. The interrogation room was cold and minimalistic, designed to strip away any distractions. Two-way mirrors allowed other detectives to observe, taking meticulous notes. The room smelled faintly of bleach, and the hum of fluorescent lights filled the space with an oppressive intensity. Psychologists had advised the interrogation team on Caldwell's profile: narcissistic, manipulative, highly intelligent, yet prone to self-preservation. Detectives began by reviewing his movements, employment history, and the minor inconsistencies in his past statements. They knew that breaking his facade would require patience, careful questioning, and psychological pressure. The first few hours were slow, with Caldwell speaking sparingly. He acknowledged basic personal facts, such as where he had lived, his jobs, and the girls he had known casually. The detectives allowed him to talk while subtly steering the conversation toward the disappearances. They brought up Riverside, the years 2007 to 2009, where Eliza Monroe and Sophie Delgado had vanished. Caldwell remained calm, often smirking faintly when asked about the girls, as if testing how much the investigators knew. He was clever, trying to gauge their confidence, their knowledge, their intentions. Then, detectives began presenting him with evidence: the digitized cold case files, witness statements, and correlations with his financial and residential history. Small details, seemingly innocuous on their own, became a mosaic he could not ignore. For instance, receipts showing interstate travel corresponding with the timeframes of Maya Patel, Claire Jensen, and Isabella Ramos's disappearances. A series of local tips placing him near Hannah Nguyen's last known location in Baltimore. They laid out patterns, dates, and minor inconsistencies he had left behind over the years. Each piece was deliberate, calculated to provoke recognition without giving him room to maneuver. Hours into the interrogation, Caldwell's calm demeanor began to crack subtly. He shifted in his chair, tapping fingers nervously. The team maintained steady pressure, alternating between silence and pointed questions. Detectives recounted details that only someone with intimate knowledge could provide, details he had overlooked or assumed would be buried by time. Slowly, cracks appeared in his carefully constructed narrative. Small admissions, lies, exaggerations, moments of hesitation started to emerge, each one building momentum. By the end of the second day, Caldwell finally began speaking about the Riverside disappearances, albeit obliquely. "Those girls, it wasn't like anyone thinks," he said, voice flat, trying to minimize, rationalize, and distance himself emotionally. Detectives pressed gently but firmly. "Eliza Monroe, Sophie Delgado, we know the dates, the locations, the circumstances. Start from the beginning. Tell us the truth." Reluctantly, he began recounting his actions, his voice clinical, detached, as if narrating a story rather than confessing to crimes. He spoke of the initial arguments, the moments of panic he framed as accidents, and how he had moved to cover his tracks. He described manipulating families, the strategic placement of girls in foster and adoptive homes, using his own veneer of respectability to mask suspicion. Detectives took note of every word, aware that while his tone lacked remorse, the admissions were critical. As the questioning progressed, Caldwell eventually admitted to moving beyond Riverside, targeting vulnerable girls in Michigan, Oregon, Maryland, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. Each confession was accompanied by meticulous detail: the dates, the last known locations, the calculated methods he used to isolate and control each victim, and the steps he took to mislead law enforcement. He described disposing of belongings, manipulating foster and adoptive placements, and ensuring that any physical evidence would be minimal. It was chilling to hear, the cold, calculated efficiency of someone who had spent years perfecting his approach. Families waited anxiously for updates. When the first confirmation came, DNA links, locations of remains, and corroborating evidence, they were overwhelmed by a mixture of grief, relief, and disbelief. Karen Monroe wept, hugging her husband tightly, whispering their daughter's name. Denise Jensen sat in stunned silence, feeling the decades of fear and uncertainty finally confront reality. Margaret Ramos held her adoptive daughter's younger sibling, silently acknowledging the tragedy while appreciating that the truth had finally surfaced. Across Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Oregon, and Maryland, parents clung to one another, holding vigils, and finally allowing themselves to believe that justice might be possible. The recovery of the victims' remains began immediately after Caldwell's confession. Forensic teams traveled across states to carefully excavate the sites he had disclosed. The process was painstaking. Each location was documented with photographs, GPS coordinates, and notes about soil composition and decomposition stages. Cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and DNA analysis were employed to ensure accuracy and respect for the victims. One by one, Eliza, Sophie, Maya, Claire, Isabella, Hannah, Layla, Naomi, Gabrielle, and Victoria were identified, each confirmation providing a painful sense of closure to families who had spent years in limbo. Detectives maintained meticulous notes throughout the exhumation process. They cross-referenced Caldwell's statements with physical evidence, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. Each confirmation reinforced the interstate pattern they had suspected for years. The full scope of his crimes became clear. A highly mobile, manipulative predator targeting vulnerable teen girls across the United States, exploiting foster and adoptive systems, and concealing his actions with decades of lies. Legal proceedings were prepared simultaneously. Virginia authorities filed charges for the earliest known murder, ensuring that Caldwell would face life without parole. Michigan, Oregon, Maryland, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana prosecutors coordinated to bring charges for the subsequent murders. Each case was reinforced with DNA evidence, detailed confessions, and witness testimony. The strategy was clear. Caldwell would never see freedom again, and justice would be served across every state he had victimized. As Caldwell was led from the interrogation room to the holding cell, he displayed no emotion, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the lives he had destroyed. He had spent decades perfecting his deception, controlling appearances, and manipulating those around him. Now, facing certainty, he remained detached, a man whose ability to empathize had long since withered. The families, however, experienced a different kind of closure. Karen Monroe spoke about the years of waiting, the nights spent imagining possibilities, the holidays without her daughter, and the daily ache of unanswered questions. Denise Jensen described the fear of raising a child in a world where monsters could hide behind ordinary faces. Margaret Ramos spoke of the relief and sorrow intertwined, recognizing that while justice had arrived, it could never undo the trauma inflicted. Across the country, other families felt a tentative sense of peace, knowing that Caldwell's reign of terror had ended. Before we move on, consider this. Imagine for a moment living decades in uncertainty, holding on to hope while fearing the worst, and learning that a predator has been moving freely in your community, silently watching and waiting. How would it feel to finally have the truth, to know what really happened, and yet feel the weight of lost time, lost childhoods, and lost possibilities? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which part of this investigation shocks you the most, and what do you think could have prevented these tragedies? By 2025, with Caldwell behind bars and confessions confirmed, investigators reflected on the importance of cold case units, interstate collaboration, and technological advancements. They recognized that without persistence, meticulous record-keeping, and evolving forensic tools, these cases might never have been solved. The narrative of the missing girls became a testament to the intersection of vigilance, patience, and the refusal to let injustice go unchallenged. Caldwell's arrest and confession sent a ripple through communities that had long mourned in silence. Local news outlets ran extensive coverage, detailing the scope of his crimes and the painstaking work of law enforcement. Schools and community centers organized meetings to discuss safety measures for teens, particularly those in foster care or adoptive placements. Social workers, law enforcement, and families began collaborating more closely, inspired by the lessons learned from the Caldwell case. The morning of the trial in Virginia arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation, not just in the courthouse but across the country. Families who had been waiting decades for answers gathered outside. Journalists filed reports, and advocates for missing and exploited children attended with a quiet but resolute presence. Inside the courtroom, the air was tense yet hushed, punctuated only by the shuffle of papers and the low murmurs of attorneys and court officials preparing for the day ahead. Ethan Caldwell, the man who had eluded justice for nearly 2 decades, was present but unmoved, his demeanor flat, almost clinical. He had pleaded guilty to the murder of the first known victim, and the proceedings now centered on formally documenting his crimes and moving toward sentencing. The courtroom was heavy with the weight of history, the weight of unanswered questions, broken families, and decades of speculation and fear. The prosecution began with a concise timeline, laying out the events that had led to Caldwell's arrest. The 2023 consolidation of cold case files, the meticulous cross-referencing of DNA evidence, financial records, and past addresses, and the tireless efforts of interstate detectives were highlighted. Each piece of evidence was a testament to years of persistence and evolving technology. As the details of each victim were recounted, Eliza Monroe in California, Maya Patel in Michigan, Claire Jensen and Isabella Ramos in Oregon, Layla Thompson in Ohio, and the other girls whose lives had been stolen, the courtroom became silent in shared grief and disbelief. Each name was more than a statistic. Each was a young life interrupted, dreams erased, potential unfulfilled. Observers could feel the gravity, the immense ripple effect that one predator's choices had on countless families and communities across multiple states. The judge paused at intervals, allowing the gravity of the words to sink in. Families were given the opportunity to speak, and when the first victim impact statement was read aloud, there were tears, whispered memories, and moments of painful silence. Denise Jensen, mother of Claire, described the early days of her daughter's disappearance, the frantic calls, the late-night drives searching for any sign, and the crushing weight of not knowing. Her voice quivered as she recounted the fear that Claire might never be found, the hope that she might have escaped harm, and the slow, relentless, creeping despair that marked each year. Her statement was a reminder of the emotional cost borne by families long before the legal system could catch up. Across the courtroom, other parents nodded in silent recognition, having lived parallel journeys of anguish, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. In between these statements, small moments of engagement could be felt in the subtle ways the courtroom acknowledged the public. Outside, viewers following live broadcasts were encouraged to reflect. How does a community cope when a predator is not only unknown, but capable of crossing state lines undetected? How do families rebuild their sense of safety when the person responsible was a neighbor, a foster parent, or someone trusted? These questions echoed silently to those watching, drawing the audience into a reflective space. Even without directly asking for comments, the story itself prompted viewers to consider, if you were in the position of one of these families, what would you want the world to understand? As the court proceedings continued, the legal team carefully laid out Caldwell's methods, revealing the systematic, manipulative, and calculated nature of his actions. Each disappearance followed a pattern. Victims who were either adopted, in foster care, or temporarily under Caldwell's supervision. He had exploited positions of trust, often integrating himself into families' lives, quietly observing vulnerabilities, and then moving when suspicion was lowest. Investigators recounted minor behaviors that, at the time, went unnoticed. Odd comments, unexplained absences, shifts in demeanor from the girls. Looking back, they were breadcrumbs, overlooked due to procedural limitations and the presumption of parental responsibility. The courtroom listened intently, the silence heavy with the implication that these signals had existed all along, but only now could be interpreted within the tragic context of Caldwell's crimes. Victim impact statements continued. Gabrielle Ortiz's adoptive mother spoke of the silent years, the holidays spent in quiet dread, and the haunting what-ifs that consumed every moment of her daily life. "We always wondered if she remembered our house as a safe place," she said, voice shaking. "We wanted to believe she was somewhere happy, somewhere safe." And then the truth arrived, and it hurt more than we could ever explain. Her statement drew tears from families in the courtroom and from those watching remotely. At points like these, the script could encourage subtle engagement. viewers could be prompted to share memories of advocacy moments in their own communities, or reflect on systemic gaps they've observed in their local areas. This engagement doesn't distract from the story, but allows the audience to internalize and discuss the societal implications. The prosecution also emphasized the crucial role of evolving forensic technology. DNA evidence, once limited and cumbersome, had become the key that unlocked decades-old mysteries. Samples preserved from distant crime scenes were digitized and cross-checked with national databases, and for the first time, investigators could see connections that had been invisible before. Financial records, employment history, and travel data painted a picture of Caldwell's mobility, explaining how he could commit crimes in California, Michigan, Oregon, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana while remaining under the radar. Analysts noted how small oversights, like inconsistent employment reporting, frequent moves, and minor legal infractions, served as potential indicators of risk, but the lack of coordination between states at the time had allowed these signals to remain unnoticed. By 2025, lessons learned from these oversights were being shared with law enforcement agencies nationwide, improving the processes for monitoring, reporting, and collaborating on missing person cases. Families took their turns recounting the personal impacts. Naomi Brooks' older brother spoke about the toll the disappearance had taken on his own sense of safety. "You grow up knowing that someone out there took my sister away, and no one could stop them. That fear never leaves you," he said, voice tight with emotion. The narrative wove a pattern of collective loss, grief, and resilience, illustrating not only the damage inflicted by Caldwell but also the enduring strength of the families who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. This part of the script can encourage viewer reflection. Have you ever considered the lasting impact a single crime can have on a family for years? Share your thoughts below. The engagement is natural, tied to the emotional resonance of the story without feeling forced. As the courtroom drama unfolded, the defense team did not attempt to minimize Caldwell's actions. Instead, the focus was on procedural matters, ensuring that all confessions, evidence, and legal documentation were properly recorded for both Virginia and Michigan jurisdictions. Judges and attorneys collaborated across state lines to ensure that each crime was accounted for, and that Caldwell's life sentence in Virginia would be reinforced by additional sentences in Michigan, eliminating any possibility of parole. It was a legal orchestration designed to ensure that the man who had caused so much pain could never harm another person. When the sentencing was finally pronounced, Caldwell was given life without parole for each murder. The gavel fell with a resonant finality, yet the courtroom remained heavy with complex emotions. Relief mingled with sorrow. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but the scars carried by families and communities were enduring. The judge's words emphasized accountability, societal responsibility, and the importance of listening to vulnerable children. The statement was not merely directed at Caldwell, but at society, to observe, to prevent, and to act when warning signs appear. This moment could also be used as a subtle CTA for viewer engagement, prompting them to reflect on how their communities can better protect children, or how policy changes might prevent future tragedies, thereby fostering discussion in the comments. Advocates for missing children spoke about the broader implications. The Caldwell case highlighted gaps in interstate communication, the need for digitized case files, and the importance of cold case units maintaining vigilance over unresolved cases. Schools, foster agencies, and social services took note, organizing workshops, awareness campaigns, and training sessions for staff and volunteers. Families who had been in the shadows now had their voices amplified, inspiring others to take preventative action. The story expanded beyond individual tragedy, becoming a call to action for systemic improvements that could protect future generations. Even as the trial concluded, the emotional journey did not end. Parents, siblings, and friends of the victims began to meet regularly, forming networks of support. Community centers in Michigan, Ohio, and California held forums for teens and parents to discuss personal safety, mental health, and recognizing signs of manipulation or abuse. The narrative illustrated the idea that a single case, while tragic, can spark broader awareness and cultural shifts that extend far beyond its immediate context. At this point in the script, viewers could again be prompted to engage, How do you think communities can respond more effectively when teens go missing? Share your suggestions in the comments to help inform and educate others. Media coverage following the trial emphasized both the human and systemic elements of the Caldwell case. Stories ran not only about the crimes, but also about the decades-long pursuit of justice. Analysts discussed how the integration of modern technology and persistent detective work had made it possible to solve cases that seemed impossible decades earlier. Community members reflected on lessons learned and emphasized vigilance, trust in law enforcement, and the critical need to listen to children, particularly those in vulnerable living situations. By highlighting these elements, the narrative reinforced a multi-layered approach. The story was not just about Caldwell, but about how society collectively responds to tragedy, prevention, and accountability. By the end of the courtroom proceedings in Michigan, families had delivered their final impact statements. Each narrative was raw and unfiltered. Descriptions of lost birthdays, empty rooms, holiday traditions without loved ones, and the pervasive uncertainty that had shaped their lives. One parent summed up the collective sentiment saying, "We will never get our children back, but we demand that their stories are heard, remembered, and used to prevent this from happening again." It was a declaration of enduring commitment, one that the audience could connect with emotionally, creating a natural bridge to reflecting on their own roles as community members, parents, educators, or advocates. The sentencing reinforced the permanence of justice. Caldwell would die in prison, his freedom irrevocably removed. But while the legal system had acted decisively, the emotional closure for families was gradual. Support networks, therapy, advocacy, and community involvement all became tools for healing. The narrative emphasized that justice is not only about incarceration, but also about rebuilding, learning, and ensuring that the victims' lives, tragically cut short, carry forward meaning, awareness, and impact. And as the courtrooms emptied, the story's broader legacy became evident. Cold case investigators, armed with the knowledge and lessons from Caldwell's crimes, shared insights with agencies across the nation. Protocols were updated, data sharing improved, and awareness campaigns expanded. Foster care agencies, social workers, and schools implemented enhanced training on recognizing manipulative behaviors and safeguarding children. Families and communities began annual remembrance initiatives for missing children, not only honoring those lost but also promoting vigilance and preventive measures. Through these actions, the victims' legacies extended beyond individual grief into societal awareness and action. Finally, as the sun set on the long journey toward justice, the families of Caldwell's victims found a measure of closure. They were left with the memories of their children, the pain of years lost, but also the knowledge that justice, though delayed, had been achieved. They understood that the lessons learned from these cases could prevent future tragedies, influence policy, and educate communities nationwide. It was a sobering yet empowering realization. While nothing could undo the past, the present and future could be shaped by vigilance, awareness, and advocacy. Thank you for joining us in uncovering stories hidden in the shadows. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every truth deserves to be told. To follow more cold cases, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share these stories. Your support helps keep their voices alive.